makes the phenomenology too complex. Another worry is a potential regress, that, you know, if you've got to be aware of that, when you see the bottle, you've got to be aware of seeing the bottle, you have to be aware of the awareness of the seeing the bottle, and aware of the awareness of the seeing the bottle, and on you go. You might think you're going to need to have a very big brain to make this sort of theory correct. I think there's actually a couple of different versions of the ubiquity model. One has been made well known in the recent analytic tradition by Wed April, who's been referred to a couple of times. This is the self-representational model, where the relevant form of awareness is a kind of representation. So experience involves phenomenal representation of a content, like the red dot. There being a bottle over there. Okay, it involves that, but it also involves a representation of that representation. So in seeing the red dot, I represent the red dot, and I represent that I'm representing the red dot. And you've got a higher order self-representation at the same time. So on this view, I think it's plausible that phenomenally representing the P, the distinctive form of representation we have in consciousness, entails phenomenally representing that one phenomenally represents P. So that's one model. I think this does lead to I've got a couple of worries about this model. One is whether it's whether representation is the best way of thinking about our relation to our experiences and our mental states. I think there's a lot to be said for the thought that's more direct than that. Another is the regress worry that seems to arise more naturally on this model. I actually have got a preference for a somewhat different model that involves not the notion of understands the relevant awareness relation of one's mental states, not as representation, but as a form of acquaintance. So a rough idea, experience involves a phenomenal representation of a content. When I experience the red bottle is part of the content of my experience, but I've also got, ubiquitously a form of awareness of one's visually experiencing the red bottle. That's not a matter of my representing the proposition. By representing that there's a red bottle there, of my entertaining the proposition there's a red bottle there. Rather, it's a matter of my standing in a direct acquaintance relation to my visually experiencing the red bottle, or to my phenomenally representing the red bottle. So first order experience is a matter of standing in a relation to a proposition, to a content. But this form of awareness we have of our mental states is rather best seen as a form of direct acquaintance. Now acquaintance is of course a bit of a mysterious notion, and fortunately time is starting to run out, so I'm not going to be able to say too much about it. But roughly, acquaintance with X then is a I guess a primitive relation to X, primitive epistemic relation to X, if you like. One that serves to ground such things. It's a basic relation to an object, or perhaps to a state of affairs. One that serves to ground to an object or a property instance, or to a state of affairs. One that serves to ground attention to X, attention to that thing, one's ability to demonstrate that thing, one's ability to form a concept of that thing, and indeed one's knowledge of that thing. I mean, the idea of acquaintance goes back to Russell, for those of you familiar with that tradition, as acquaintance serves as a sort of primitive, non-conceptual epistemic relation. Epistemic relation, it's in the sphere of knowledge, belief, and so on, but it's more primitive than knowledge and belief. It doesn't require concepts, for example. A form of direct acquaintance, one that can be used to ground knowledge and belief. And of course, there are many mysteries about acquaintance, which I leave here as a problem for further work. I have discussed acquaintance a bit in some other papers. There's certainly a lot more to be said. But the thought then is that, okay, so whenever one consciously thinks P, for example, one will be acquainted with one's thinking the P, with one's consciously thinking the P. And this acquaintance with one's consciously thinking the P, which is a form of non-conceptual acquaintance, if you like, will ground one's introspective knowledge that one is thinking the P. So, I mean, that's a further step from being acquainted with something to one knowing about it. One needs to kind of take up the acquaintance relation in a thought and think about it. One's acquainted with one thinking that people serve as the ground for one's introspective knowledge that one's thinking the P. When one gains that introspective knowledge, one will then have a new thought, the thought that one's thinking the P. Previously, one just had the thought the P. Now one has the thought that one's thinking the P. The resulting acquaintance with consciously thinking, I'm thinking P, will then serve to ground one's knowledge, one's higher order knowledge, one is thinking, I'm thinking the P. And on you go. So you get a kind of regress here. Acquaintance with P at one level serves to ground knowledge that one's thinking with P at the next level. and on you go. But you don't get an actual regress here, because acquaintance with an act of thinking at any given time doesn't entail the existence of a further act of thinking. It just grounds the possibility of that further act of thinking. So I think the acquaintance model has an advantage over the self-representational model, and there's no worry about an actual regress that arises. It's just potential regresses. And potential regresses, as we know in philosophy, are benign. Let's hope. Just say something very briefly on experience of the self, and how this brings us back to the Hume dialectic. Well, acquaintance with thinking the P arguably involves acquaintance with one's thinking the P. It's acquaintance with an instance of a property or with a state. Arguably, one doesn't just have bare acquaintance with properties or states. One's thinking the P or acts. One's aware of something as having those properties. So, a prima facie acquaintance with my thinking the P, or my seeing the red bottle, really is acquaintance with my thinking the P, or with my seeing the red bottle. At least it's acquaintance with some things, thinking the P, or something, seeing the red bottle. So I experience the thinking. If I'm acquainted with the thinking, the wanting, the seeing, the feeling, and so on, it's not just that I'm acquainted in a free-floating way with each of them. Those experiences are bound in that they seem to be experiences of a common entity. And this is the point I tried to make after Jesse's talk yesterday. Maybe that suffices for something counting as experience of a self. Experiencing all these properties as properties of single entities suffices for experience of a self. And just the way of experiencing the properties, grayness, being covered with buttons, having a certain location and size here, suffices for being aware of this remote control. So this would be a kind of, if so, this would count, I think, as a kind of experience of self. It would be a kind of pre-reflective, pre-conceptual experience of self, one that needn't deploy concepts for the same reasons that acquaintance doesn't. Again, Sarah, the 3-year-old subject, may not even have the concept of thinking, the concept of self. Rather, a kind of pre-reflective, pre-conceptual consciousness of self, but still of self as subject of mental states. And this parallels an idea which I think is absolutely ubiquitous in the phenomenological tradition, this kind of pre-reflective self-awareness associated with such figures as Brentano, Husserl, Sartre, and many others. The alternative is to say that one's acquaintance with thinking the P is just acquaintance with the property, and there's no binding that goes on at that level, involving acquaintance with oneself, one's own thinking the P. If not, then maybe you get something analogous at the introspective level. At the very least, you could form the introspective experience of one's thinking the P. This would also apply on the introspective model, as well as the ubiquity model. You still have introspective contents, maybe conceptual contents of the form, I'm thinking the P, I'm judging the P, I'm seeing the red bottle, I'm wanting this, and that would at least ground the kind of reflective consciousness of self as subject. So on the first view, you'd have a kind of experience of the self ubiquitous in all experience, even prior to introspection, in ordinary perception. On the second view, you'd have experience of self even in introspection. So this is the way that I think that denying the strong transparency claim about mental states can lead not just to a model for knowledge of one's mental states, but a model for experience of the self and perhaps ultimately knowledge of the self. Something very quickly, second last slide, on the unreliability of introspection. This does raise questions about the issues of unreliability that Eric and others have raised. I mean, you might think, boy, this acquaintance model suggests that introspection should be really easy. I mean, you're acquainted with something, what do? You just attend to it? I mean, I guess the thought of something is you're acquainted with a mental state, this enables you to attend to it, that enables you to demonstrate it, to form a concept of it, form beliefs about it, form knowledge about it. I mean, something like that is the model, but that also might suggest this is very easy. Does this acquaintance model suggest introspection is easy, so we ought to be much more reliable than we are? Well, I do think this kind of model does yield a very limited class of infallible introspective beliefs, and that's something I've tried to argue for in a different way elsewhere. Still, it's worth noting that much can go wrong when acquaintance is used in cognition. There are all kinds of limitations of this model. I mean, most obviously, the model doesn't apply to non-conscious states. It doesn't give us any kind of special epistemic relation to those. Second, introspection. The use of acquaintance in introspection always, I think, relies on a prior application of attention. And attention, of course, can change states. So this method, acquaintance, I think, gives us no direct guidance regarding non-attentive experience. Many of the questions that Eric raises concerns the character of experiences that we haven't been attending to. And I don't think this model gives any special help there. Further, even